Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, December 13th, 2022. First story at the top of antiwar.com today. The Senate is expected to vote on the Yemen War Powers Resolution on Tuesday. So this bill, the Yemen War Powers Resolution that would end U.S. support for the Saudi war and blockade on Yemen, is expected to be voted on this week by the Senate and could be brought to the floor as soon as Tuesday. And this war has killed, this is according to the UN's estimate as of the end of 2021. So it's an older estimate. And it's believed to be a very conservative estimate that this war has killed 377,000 people. And more than half of that are people that have died of starvation and disease caused by the war and the blockade. And more than half of that number is also children under 5. So it's a very brutal war. So Bernie Sanders said last week that he would bring the resolution to the floor and that he believes he has enough votes to pass the legislation. And Americans can pressure, depending on when you're listening to this, last minute calls are a good thing, I think. And Americans can pressure their members of Congress. You could dial 1-833-STOP-WAR. They make it very easy for you. You put in your zip code and they connect you to each member of Congress that you have, your 2 senators and your representative in order. So you call one. Once that call is done, goes to the next one. It's very easy. And this resolution, it has strong support from Democrats in the Senate, but according to Demand Progress, which is an activist group that has put together a very helpful list of which members of Congress have come out publicly in support of this resolution. According to them, only Rand Paul, he's the only Republican that has come out publicly in favor of the resolution. Although you also have Mike Lee in the Senate, Republican from Utah. And I would guess that he would support the bill because he has led previous efforts to try to end the war in Yemen, very outspoken against this war in the past. So just because they're on that list doesn't mean that they're not going to vote yes. But you could click, if you go to this story at the top of antiwar.com, you can find the link to find that list and see where your member of Congress sits on this issue. Or it's really, again, it's if they've come out publicly in favor of this resolution. So a version of the resolution has also been introduced in the House, which has received more bipartisan support. It has 118 co-sponsors, which is a lot for a bill, including 10 Republicans. And last week, a group of House Democrats released a joint statement urging a swift passage of the resolution, and included on that list was Adam Schiff, about as mainstream a Democrat as you can get. He's the chair of the House Intelligence Committee. So I think this thing has a really good chance of passing. And a similar resolution was passed back in 2019, but the effort was vetoed by President Trump. So we'll see. I mean, if they get this done, they have to do it quick. The Congress session is almost over. The holidays are coming up, and then they're going to swear in the new Congress. So if this doesn't get passed through by then, they're going to have to restart this whole process, introduce it, get co-sponsors, all that. So hopefully this happens, and it happens quick. And this is a good time to do it because the Democrats are not happy with the Saudis. And the situation right now in Yemen is that a ceasefire expired in October. There's been an increase in fighting on the ground, but there have been no reported Saudi airstrikes in Yemen or Houthi attacks inside Saudi Arabia. Hassan al-Tayyab, who works for the Friends Committee on National Legislation, lobby group that's really good on this. He's on the Scott Horton show all the time talking about this issue. He's really good at keeping people informed on the current situation. And he said last week, quote, that by removing the possibility of more U.S. support for Riyadh and its partners to renew airstrikes in Yemen, Congress can play a constructive role to keep the pressure on the Saudis to negotiate an extension of the truce, end quote. So ending U.S. support for the war would effectively ground the Saudi Air Force, as it is pretty much entirely reliant on U.S. maintenance. And the US backed coalition in Yemen is notorious for bombing civilians. And civilian casualties spiked earlier this year, right before the ceasefire was reached in March. This was right when Russia invaded Ukraine. The Saudis were bombing, really ramped up the bombing campaign in Yemen, killed a bunch of civilians, and then the ceasefire was reached. So if the war restarts, we could end up right there again. And while this ceasefire has brought a lot of relief, the blockade has been eased somewhat. They're allowing more ships to go into Hodeidah, the Red Sea port, and they're allowing some flights in and out of the Sana'a airport. The blockade has not been fully lifted, so the situation is still really bad for the people on the ground there. So, it's rare that there's good news, but if this thing passes, I think Biden, I doubt he would veto it. There's definitely going to be loopholes for him to continue support, but this is going to give the pressure, really send him and the Saudis a message that U.S. support for this war is not going to last. All right, the next one here. NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg said that the trust between the West and Russia has been destroyed and that relations could not return to normal even after the fighting ended in Ukraine. So Stoltenberg is forecasting that even after this war, things are not going to be good between the West and Russia. He told CNBC, quote, "Even if the fighting ends, we will not return to some kind of normal, friendly relationship with Russia. Trust has been destroyed. I think the war has had long-lasting consequences for the relationship with Russia," end quote. Now, of course, Stoltenberg claimed that NATO tried to build good relations with Russia after the Cold War. But of course, that's not true because we all know that the alliance ratcheted up tensions with Moscow by expanding up to Russia's border. And when NATO began its post-Cold War expansion, when we talk about this stuff, it's always good to point out, don't just take it from me and, other anti-war folks out there. George Kennan is who I quote in this, and he is a late American diplomat credited with crafting the containment strategy during the Cold War. He was a Cold Warrior. And he said when NATO expansion first began in the 1990s that there was no reason whatsoever to do it. And he said it was a tragic mistake and that Russia was going to eventually respond, in some way. And his warning, was not heeded, and they continued to keep expanding NATO. So after Stoltenberg made his comments, or on the same day, Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, he expressed a different view. He said that economic cooperation with Russia could be possible after the war. He said, quote, "At the moment, the relations we have are being reduced, end quote." So that's him just saying relations are not good. But he added that if Russia ends the war, they should be given the chance to resume economic ties. Although Germany's options for resuming trade with Russia have been limited by the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. Those are the natural gas pipelines that connect Russia to Germany that were bombed. I believe that was in September. But anyway, so, that has made it a lot harder for if Germany wants to resume its trade relationship with Russia and get all that nice, cheap Russian natural gas. It's a lot more difficult now. Although Russia did say that there's one line. So there's Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. Each pipeline has two lines. And Russia says Nord Stream 2 has one line that was not damaged. So they could potentially send gas through there. And, I just have to mention, in the years prior to Russia invading Ukraine, Germany was under heavy pressure from the U.S. to scrap Nord Stream 2. That was the new pipeline. And it never has delivered gas to Germany. But the construction was completed despite U.S. sanctions. The U.S. really went after this pipeline, but Scholz paused it around the time Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, of course, there's no evidence, and it's been pretty quiet about who, these investigations into who attacked these pipelines. Of course, the U.S. has the motive. They seem pretty happy about it. Antony Blinken called it a tremendous opportunity to get Europe off Russian gas. But, we don't have concrete evidence that the U.S. or one of its allies, like the British, Russia accused the British I think they're definitely a very likely suspect. The Poles, maybe, but we don't know for sure. And unfortunately, there's a good chance that any real. It's going to be tough to trust any investigation that comes from a NATO country. All right, but that is that. The next article here. This is from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute, and Ukraine has taken more action against the Orthodox Church, the one that has ties to Russia, and has seized assets of Russian Orthodox clerics. So they're not exactly Russian Orthodox. So, from just my surface level research into the situation here, there's two Orthodox churches in Ukraine. One of them has ties to Russia, and the other doesn't. I mean, I'm sure it might to some extent, but the one that Ukraine is going after is the one with ties to Russia, which, again, according to my very basic research, has more parishes in Ukraine, so has more members in Ukraine than the one that's not affiliated with Russia. And so Zelensky sanctioned 7 senior clerics from the Russian Orthodox Church, from the Russian affiliated Orthodox Church in Ukraine, although they have kind of distanced themselves from Russia since the invasion. But that wasn't good enough for Zelensky. He said, quote, "We are doing everything to ensure that the aggressor state does not have a single string of Ukrainian society to pull," end quote. So this came after Zelensky said he was going to take action against these churches. Then he goes ahead and sanctions priests, and these sanctions seize a lot their asset. I mean, this is pretty big to be targeting priests with sanctions to take their property and seize their assets. So this is kind of his war on Russian culture inside Ukraine. Okay, so the next one here, Ukraine says that it needs $1 billion to fix energy infrastructure. So as Russian missile strikes have decimated Ukraine's energy infrastructure, Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal said on Monday that Kiev needs $1 billion to restore its power grid and heating systems. So he said that the approximate cost to repair the power sector is $500 million, and the approximate costs to repair heating systems is also $500 million. So that equals $1 billion. And he's saying that this is what's needed to rapidly repair the infrastructure here. And it's in really bad shape. I mean, he said that strikes have damaged half of Ukraine's infrastructure facilities, and more Russian strikes took place on Saturday, knocking out energy facilities in Odessa, basically blacking out the whole city, leaving over 1.5 million people without electricity. And the U.S. has been trying to rally its allies to give Ukraine more aid to help repair its energy infrastructure, but the U.S. has not raised anything near what they're asking for here. But even if Ukraine did acquire $1 billion to repair its infrastructure, I mean, it would likely still take months to repair their power grid. I don't think they would get it done before, winter's over. And Russian strikes will likely persist. The more Russia bombs these targets, the harder it's going to be, the worse it's going to be. And the reason why Russian strikes will likely persist is because Ukraine has been increasing attacks inside Russian territory. Because it's just important to point out that Russia didn't do attacks like this, which are the hallmark of any U.S. invasion, any NATO invasion of a country, is that they go for their infrastructure first, railways and power, like they did in Iraq. And this didn't start until October after the truck bombing of the Crimean Bridge, which connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. Last week, drone attacks hit several air bases inside Russian territory, as I covered a lot, including targets hundreds of miles away from the Ukrainian border. So the Russian strikes have left the Ukrainian civilians in a dire situation, as many are without power and heat, and it's freezing over there in Ukraine, and there's no relief in sight, as there's little hope for peace talks. You have this narrative over here in the U.S. and in the West that Ukraine is winning when people are really suffering. Ukrainian officials maintain that their conditions for talks with Russia are for Russia to withdraw from the territory that it has captured. That's clearly a non-starter for negotiations with Moscow. And the US and NATO continue to say we're going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. And the Pentagon reportedly now supports Ukrainian attacks inside Russia, which will lead to a further escalation. It's just going to make things worse for the people of Ukraine. So, not looking good. In the next article here, Zelensky asks the G7 for natural gas and longer range weapons. So, Zelensky addressed the group of 7 countries on Monday, and he asked for natural gas and more advanced weaponry, including fighter jets, tanks, and long range missiles. So, after the meeting, G7 leaders released a joint statement reaffirming that they will support Ukraine again for as long as it takes. So far, the U.S. has held off giving Ukraine the longer range weapons that Zelensky seeks, but the Times reported on Friday that the U.S. is more likely to provide such arms as it now tacitly supports Ukrainian attacks deep inside Russian territory, which risks a major escalation of the war. The G7 meeting on Monday was more focused on financial aid for Ukraine rather than military assistance. Scholz, the German chancellor, said that the G7 was focused on both short-term and long-term needs, including the country's post-war construction, which he likened to U.S. aid for Western Europe's reconstruction after World War II, known as the Marshall Plan. The G7 leaders said that they will instruct their finance ministers to hold a meeting soon to coordinate with the IMF on providing Ukraine with aid to cover its 2023 budget, which has a deficit of about $38 billion that Kiev expects its Western backers to cover. So again, in this article, I just mentioned that this meeting comes as amid these large-scale Russian attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And Biden spoke with Zelensky by phone on Sunday and told him that the U.S. is prioritizing its support for Ukraine by helping them out with air defense systems as they're facing all these Russian strikes. All right, the next article here, Japan to buy U.S.-made Tomahawk missiles. So this is a big deal. As I went over, I think it was last week. I can't remember. But Japan is making some serious plans to really beef up its military, which breaks from its decades policy of what they call pacifism, and that's what I referred to as here in this article. But they do have a big military, but it's technically for self-defense. But purchasing Tomahawk missiles, which have a very long range, over 1,000 miles, so long-range missiles, this is big because this gives Japan the ability to strike other countries. So the Washington Post reported this on Monday, citing U.S. and Japanese officials. So the purchase will give Japan long-range strike capabilities, although Japanese officials are still framing the plan as self-defense and say that they need a counter-strike capability. So the Tomahawks would put targets in China and North Korea in range. U.S. and Japanese officials said that Japan has yet to formally request the Tomahawks, but the report said that the Biden administration supports the plan for Tokyo to purchase the missiles, which are made by Raytheon, the former employer of Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense. So the U.S. has been really encouraging Japan to build up its military as part of its strategy against China, similar to how they encouraged Japan to build up their military way back in the 1800s, and that didn't turn out very well. But anyway, the Tomahawks are expected to take about 5 years to be delivered to Japan. And the purchase would be part of the Prime Minister Kishida's plan to more than double the country's military spending over the next 5 years, which involves spending $318 billion. This was an interesting figure from the Washington Post that I didn't realize, but it makes sense considering Japan's GDP. So Kishida wants to bring Japan's military spending to about 2% of its gross domestic product, GDP. And that's the level that NATO wants all of its members to reach. So if Japan reaches that goal in 5 years, unless other countries make drastic changes as well, it would make its military budget the third highest in the world, behind China and the U.S. And the U.S. is still by far the biggest military spender. It outspends China by hundreds of billions of dollars a ton. But still, I mean, that's a pretty striking figure. So, I mean, they're trying to more than double their military spending. So I guess it makes sense. Japanese officials told the Post that the purchase of the Tomahawks and increasing military spending would assure the U.S. that they have a strong ally in Tokyo. Besides pushing Japan to boost its armed forces, the U.S. has also been encouraging Tokyo to increase military cooperation with other countries in the region. And Japan signed a deal with Australia, the first kind of deal they ever signed since the end of World War II. So a major shift is happening with Japan. And it's all part of the U.S. strategy against China. So the next one here, China and the U.S. held talks, and they discussed how to properly handle Taiwan differences, according to China's foreign ministry. So a senior U.S. delegation traveled to China for 2 days of talks. It was led by Daniel Crittenbrink, if I'm pronouncing that right. He's the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific, and Laura Rosenberger. She's the Senior Director for China and Taiwan at the National Security Council. So these two U.S. officials met with China's Vice Foreign Minister Xi Fang in the Chinese city of Langfang. And the talks followed a recent meeting between President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping in Bali, Indonesia. That was on the sidelines of the G20 summit. So according to the Chinese Foreign Ministry, to the spokesman Wang Wenbin, he said, quote, the two sides had in-depth communication on following through on the common understandings between the two heads of state in Bali, advancing consultations on the principles guiding China-U.S. relations, properly handling important and sensitive issues in bilateral relations, including the Taiwan question, end quote. So according to the South China Morning Post, the U.S. delegation was part of the preparation for Secretary of State Antony Blinken's planned visit to China, which is expected to happen in early 2023. So the U.S. and China have really increased their communication, which is good, but a thaw of relations is not expected because the U.S. is framing this engagement with China as a managing of competition rather than attempts to really resolve issues and really de-escalate tensions over Taiwan. Doesn't seem to be the U.S. interest. I think they do want to prolong, I don't think they want to have to respond to any sort of conflict over Taiwan right now, but I think, it's clear that their policies are going to provoke China. But, considering they're depleting their stockpiles, sending everything to Ukraine, I do think that, they want to manage it for now. And that's why they are increasing these talks. But I don't think we should be under any illusion that the U.S. really wants to reduce tensions with China. I mean, how many times have they said that China is, the main priority? It's clearly their focus is building up in Asia. So, and I just mentioned that the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, which is also expected to be voted on by the Senate this week, would give Taiwan unprecedented military aid, $3 billion in annual military aid. They haven't done that. They've sold them weapons since 1979 when the U.S. severed formal relations with Taiwan, but they've never financed those weapons sales. So when asked about the plan, China's foreign ministry said that the U.S. should, quote, stop using Taiwan to contain China, stop military contact with Taiwan, and refrain from further undermining China-U.S. relations, end quote. So that's that. The next article here, the last news story, this is from Jason Ditz. NATO pressed for action as tensions rise in North Kosovo. So tensions have been rising in Kosovo, and a weekend dispute in northern Kosovo has fueled a new round of controversy and tensions as the Kosovar military threatened to move against ethnic Serbs who were blocking the road leading to a standoff. So things like this do happen from time to time, mostly starting with the Kosovo government preventing the northern Serbs from trading across the border with neighboring Serbia. And also Kosovo has been trying to implement this new law where they have to change license plates from Serbia plates to Kosovo ones and identity documents, and the ethnic Serbs in the north there are not happy about it. And this leads to a lot of threats and back and forths and unresolved standoffs. So, with its endless military operation in Kosovo, NATO finds itself again, almost being sucked into uh, clashes here in northern Kosovo. NATO has never left Kosovo since the 1998 war against Serbia. So Kosovo wants NATO to intervene on their side against the Serbs, while Serbia did contact NATO and ask permission to deploy peacekeepers into Kosovo to prevent a crackdown against the ethnic Serbs. So NATO's original war in Kosovo in 1998 gave the region de facto independence from Serbia, though the Serbians have never recognized that as legal. This has led to NATO to a more or less forever deployment in the center of an ever-sparking powder keg, assured to be impacted alliance-wide if and when it falls apart. So the Kosovo War preceded a deep NATO expansion into the Balkans, former Warsaw Pact areas. Far from bringing in any enhanced regional stability, it has just left NATO kind of in the middle of everything there. And, issues like this always arise. So, you could say this is kind of an endless war, even though, it hasn't been hot in a while for NATO, but they're still there. And I believe there's about, I forget the number of U.S. troops actually, so I'm not going to guess, but there are a decent amount of U.S. troops in Kosovo. But yeah, it's just an area to keep an eye on. But that's it for the news, and we have some great viewpoints. We've one from Ted Snyder, not trusting Russia with a ceasefire, just about how Western officials in Ukraine are always saying they can't trust Russia to, adhere to a ceasefire, and kind of exposing the hypocrisy. And he mentions Angela Merkel, the former German chancellor, recently said that the Minsk agreements that were reached in 2014 and 2015 to reach a ceasefire in the Donbass war, she's saying that they were meant to give Ukraine time, because back then they could have, they had a much weaker military than they do today, than they did on February 24th when Russia invaded. So kind of revealing comments. Although I think there was a lot of sentiment in Germany that they really did want to end that war, because they were building Nord Stream 2 and all that. But still, the fact that she said that is pretty revealing. And then we have one from Ted Galen Carpenter. How will the blob react if Ukraine faces defeat? Go check that out. Our spotlight is from our friend Caitlin Johnstone, which is a good one. The season finale of the hit show Proxy War, just kind of about all the propaganda, kind of making fun of it. But that's it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow with a lot more news. As always, support the show, antiwar.com/donate, like, subscribe on YouTube, share the show. You can buy antiwar.com t-shirts and stuff like that in the link down below. But that's it for me. I will catch you tomorrow. Thanks for listening.